The old house stood silently at the edge of the main countryside, surrounded by thick trees and a dense fog that crept along the ground, cloaking everything in a veil of mist. The house had always been there, a relic of a time long past. The wooden walls were weathered, the roof sagging in places, but it had a sort of quiet dignity if you didn't look too closely. I hadn't planned on coming back here. The memories from my childhood were hazy, full of strange, uneasy feelings that I couldn't quite explain. But when I received the letter from Grandma, urging me to visit, I felt a pull I couldn't ignore. Perhaps it was guilt, knowing that my grandparents were aging and isolated. Or perhaps it was something else, something darker that had drawn me back. The first few moments as I stepped out of the car were unsettling. The cold air bit at my skin, and the quiet was suffocating. It wasn't the comfortable kind of silence you might expect from a rural home. No, this was an unnatural kind of stillness, a quiet that pressed against your chest, making it difficult to breathe. I shouldn't have come back. I feel like I don't belong here anymore. The house feels different. It's like it's alive in a way. Like it's waiting for something. Or someone. The sound of my footsteps on the gravel seemed to echo too loudly as I made my way to the door. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the faded wood and cracked windows. A chill ran through me as I reached for the handle, pulling the door open. The inside of the house smelled musty, like stale wood and dust. Nothing had changed in the years I'd been away. The same faded wallpaper adorned the walls, and the same wooden furniture sat, untouched, in the rooms. But it didn't feel like the home I remembered. It felt wrong. I could feel it in the air. Something was different. Grandma. Grandpa. I called, my voice echoing through the emptiness. But the only response was the soft creak of the floorboards from somewhere deeper in the house. I found Grandma in the kitchen, standing by the stove. She looked the same, her silver hair neatly tied back in a bun, her face soft with age, but there was something in her eyes that wasn't quite right. She smiled warmly when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. They were distant, like she was looking through me rather than at me. "Well, look who's finally decided to come back," she said, her voice warm but tinged with an undertone of something I couldn't place. "I wasn't sure you'd come." I smiled, though it felt forced. "I'm here now, Grandma. Your grandfather's out in the garden," she said, nodding toward the back of the house. "He'll be glad to see you." I didn't respond immediately, my mind still clouded by the sense of unease that had settled over me the moment I entered the house. But I nodded and made my way toward the garden. The backyard had once been meticulously cared for, but now it was overgrown, the garden left to run wild. Weeds crawled up the stone pathway, and vines twisted around the wrought iron gate. Grandpa was sitting on the old wooden bench beneath the large oak tree, staring out at the woods in the distance. His posture was rigid, as if he were waiting for something, though he didn't seem to notice me approach. "Grandpa," I called softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned slowly, his gaze empty and distant. His face was drawn, older than I remembered, his eyes heavy with the weight of years I couldn't fathom. But there was something in his stare, something deep and hollow, as though he were lost in a place far beyond the present. "Hello, child," he said softly, his voice a raspy whisper. "I thought you might come back eventually." I stood there, unsure of what to say. He didn't seem to see me, not really. It was like I was standing in front of a stranger, someone who wore my grandfather's skin but wasn't truly him. "How have you been?" I asked, trying to break the tension. But as soon as the words left my lips, I felt foolish. I already knew the answer. Grandpa's gaze never wavered from the woods. "Things have changed around here," he said, his voice low, almost regretful. "Things I wish I could forget." I waited, but he didn't elaborate. He just sat there, motionless. The air around us felt thick, like it was pressing in on me, and I couldn't breathe. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke again. "Do you remember the dog?" His voice broke the silence, his words trembling in the quiet air. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I remember. You told me he just disappeared one night. But I was too young to understand." He stiffened at the mention of the dog, his hands clenching into fists in his lap. "After the dog disappeared," he said quietly, "everything changed. I changed." His words hung in the air like a dark cloud. I wanted to ask more, to understand what had happened, but I knew that whatever he was about to say would change everything. And part of me was afraid to hear it. That night, I tried to sleep, but the house felt different, colder than it should have been. I kept hearing noises, small sounds at first, a creak here, a rustle there, but they were enough to make my skin crawl. The wind outside howled through the trees, rattling the windows like the house itself was being shaken. I pulled the blankets up around me, trying to block out the noise, but it wasn't the wind that kept me awake. It was the feeling of being watched. I couldn't shake the sensation that there was someone or something outside, waiting. I tossed and turned in bed, unable to find comfort. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from outside my window. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, not daring to move. The footsteps stopped, but I could still hear them, as if they were standing just outside, watching. I couldn't resist. Slowly, carefully, I made my way to the window, heart pounding in my chest. I pulled back the curtain just enough to peer out into the darkness. There, standing in the woods just beyond the yard, was a figure. A man. Tall, dark, and unmoving. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, facing the house. His head was slightly tilted, as though he were studying the building or maybe studying me. I stepped back from the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My heart was racing in my chest, and my body was trembling. I didn't know what to do, what to think. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed by fear. Who is he? Why is he standing there? Why can't I look away? I backed away from the window, my body cold with fear. But even though I pulled the curtains shut, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was as though the man, whatever he was still there, still staring, still waiting. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I barely managed to eat breakfast, and when I tried to ask Grandpa about the man I'd seen, he only shook his head. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "I knew it would come for you." I froze, the weight of his words sinking in. "What do you mean? Who is he? What's going on?" Grandpa's face hardened, his hands shaking slightly. "You've seen the Watcher. The one who's been in the woods for years. It's been watching us, waiting for you to return." I didn't understand. I wanted to ask more, but the words caught in my throat. Grandpa's face was pale, his eyes distant, as if he were seeing something I couldn't. "It never leaves," he whispered. "Once it sees you, once it knows you're here, it will follow you. Forever." The second night passed in a haze of fear. I couldn't sleep, couldn't even close my eyes without seeing the figure standing in the woods. I could feel its presence even when I was alone, the heavy weight of something lurking just beyond the walls of the house. Grandpa's warning played on a loop in my mind, "It will follow you forever." And I couldn't escape it. I knew that now. When I finally dared to look outside again, there he was. The figure. Standing in the same spot, his head tilted, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. He knew I was watching. It knows. It knows I'm here. And it won't leave. Not now. Not ever. The dense forests surrounding Calverton, Montana, stretches far beyond the eyes of the average traveler. The town itself was small, so small, in fact, that you could almost miss it if you weren't paying attention. Yet, there was something unsettling about it. Something that felt like it belonged to another time, untouched by modern life. My friends, Tyler, Drew, and I had driven out to this little corner of the world for a camping trip we thought would be nothing more than an escape. I wasn't one for camping, really. Sure, I loved being outdoors, but the idea of spending a night in a tent, miles away from civilization, never quite appealed to me. But Tyler and Drew were different. They'd been planning this trip for months. They talked about it like it was the perfect way to get away from the stresses of everyday life. As we set up camp, the air felt different, thick, almost suffocating. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something about the trees, the way they loomed over us, the way the breeze barely stirred the branches, that made me feel uneasy. Still, I shrugged it off. It was just my mind running wild, I figured. After all, this was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a break from reality. Drew was the first to break the silence as he set up the fire pit, his voice carrying over the sound of cracking twigs. "Feels like we're the only ones here," he said with a chuckle, though his eyes darted to the woods as though searching for something in the distance. Tyler, always the optimist, grinned. "That's the point, man. We're here to get away from everything. No phones, no distractions, just us and nature." I tried to smile, but the feeling I couldn't shake lingered. Something was off about this place. Nightfall came quickly. The orange glow of the setting sun was replaced by the cold, unfeeling darkness of the wilderness. The fire crackled as we sat around it, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. The forest around us was eerily still, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance, carried by the wind or what little wind there was. It felt like we were trapped in some sort of time loop, cut off from everything familiar. As the night deepened, the conversations around the campfire grew quieter, replaced by a growing unease. It wasn't that we were scared, per se. But there was a strange, palpable tension in the air that none of us could ignore. The stars above twinkled like 1,000 tiny eyes, and for a moment, I felt like we were being watched. I shook the thought away, laughing it off as ridiculous. This was just camping. The dark always feels a little more menacing when you're surrounded by unfamiliar woods, doesn't it? Then, the noise stopped. The crackling of the fire, the wind whispering through the trees, it all ceased. It was as if the entire forest had held its breath, suspended in an unnerving silence. For a moment, I thought it might just be the stillness of the night, the kind of silence you hear when there are no animals, no insects, no life around to make noise. But as the seconds ticked on, the silence grew thicker, more suffocating. "Do you guys feel that?" Drew said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. He was staring into the trees, his eyes wide. Tyler, always the skeptic, gave a nervous laugh. "It's just the quiet. That's all. We're in the middle of nowhere, man. Nothing's gonna hurt us." But Drew wasn't laughing. He didn't take his eyes off the trees. "I don't know, man, it's too quiet. Like someone's watching us." I glanced at Tyler, then back at Drew. He was right, though. It felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be here, like the forest didn't want us around. My stomach twisted in unease. Later that night, after we'd all retreated to our tents, I lay awake, staring at the faint outline of the tent above me. Sleep wouldn't come. I kept hearing the rustling outside, faint and distant at first, like a deer or a raccoon moving through the brush. But the longer I listened, the more I realized it wasn't quite right. The footsteps seemed too deliberate, too consistent, and there was something about the way they circled the camp, almost as if someone, or something, was pacing around us, watching. My heart began to race as I strained to hear through the thin walls of the tent. The night was still, unnaturally so. I couldn't hear the usual sounds of crickets or night birds. It was just quiet. And then I heard it. A voice. Soft at first, a faint whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't a sound I could explain. It was like a murmur in the distance, but it was growing closer. Closer. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop, to fade away into the night. But it didn't. The whispers continued, each word more distinct than the last. At first, I thought it was Tyler or Drew, maybe joking around. But then, I realized the voice wasn't coming from any direction I could pinpoint. It was all around us, swirling in the air. I heard my name. Quiet, soft, almost like a breath. Alex. I froze, my blood running cold. It wasn't Tyler. It wasn't Drew. Tyler, came the next whisper, followed by Drew. Each name was spoken with an intimacy that chilled me to the bone. It was as though the voice knew us better than we knew ourselves. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, or perhaps my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. These weren't the sounds of nature. These were voices, human voices calling us, beckoning us into the dark. The morning light felt like a small relief, though the air was still thick with the weight of what had happened. We hadn't talked much in the early hours, each of us lost in our own thoughts. But when we stepped out of our tents, I noticed something strange. Around our camp, imprinted in the dirt, were footprints. Human footprints. But they weren't like any I'd ever seen before. They were perfectly round, the shape of a person's bare feet, but something about them was wrong. They didn't seem to lead anywhere in particular. They were just there. I bent down, inspecting them closely. They were fresh, though the soil was firm and packed. They were too perfect, too clean. It didn't make sense. I turned to Drew, but he was already backing away. "It's nothing," Drew said quickly, his voice strained. "Probably just some animal. Some weird animal. They make weird tracks sometimes, right?" But I wasn't convinced. No animal made tracks like that. No animal walked in a perfect circle around our tents. That night, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there with us. Every snap of a twig, every rustling of leaves seemed amplified in the silence. The whispers returned, louder this time, and now, there was something else, footsteps, too, coming closer and closer. We sat huddled around the fire, our eyes darting nervously into the blackness beyond the light's reach. But none of us dared speak. There was no need. The whispers grew louder, now calling all three of our names at once, and the air grew thicker with each passing moment. I could feel my heart in my throat. Drew stood suddenly, his face pale. "They know us. They've been watching us." We tried not to react, tried to stay calm, but I could feel the terror gripping me, a raw, primal fear that made me want to run anywhere, away from the trees, away from the whispers. "They're waiting," I whispered to myself. "They want us to react." The next morning, our bags were packed, and we were ready to leave, but as I turned to head back to the truck, something caught my eye. A small stick lay just outside our tent. It was smooth, about 20 centimeters long, and when I picked it up, I realized it had something carved into it. My name. My full name, carved deeply into the wood. No one had touched it. No one had been near it. We didn't talk about it. We didn't need to. But we left that campsite without a single word spoken. The image of the stick burned into my mind. The whispers hadn't stopped. They would never stop. As we drove away, the feeling didn't leave us. I could feel the eyes of the forest on my back, even as we passed the trees and headed back to the town. The woods were still there, lingering just beyond our reach. And I knew, deep down, that we hadn't escaped. They're still out there, waiting. And they don't forget.